The trauma-informed rhetoric, or what defines trauma, is typically based in a medical model in which students are defined as damaged. And we need to understand or expand what we understand to count as trauma in order to be able to recognize some of the race-based traumas that happen in our schools and act in opposition to them. Hi, I'm Erin Silcox from traumainformedteachers.com, here to bring practical tools to conscientious educators just like you. So when we talk about trauma and we typically are basing it in a medical model, we tend to miss some of the traumas that are more unrecognizable. So recognizable traumas are things like physical, sexual abuse in the home that can get reported and communicated to families. It might be, issues related to poverty, like neighborhood violence, lack of social structures in the neighborhood to, provide positive health care and things like that. So what about the other factors in the lives of our students that are traumatizing, yet might not look so on the surface and are really based in systemic issues like racism? Well, keep watching to learn how race-based traumas go unnoticed in schools because of our narrow definition of what counts as trauma. So how do we define trauma? Well, Elizabeth Dutro in 2019 wrote, "My concerns are rooted in the flightiness of the word trauma and all the complexities and how it lands on certain children." She goes on to explain that the researchers and practitioners have yet to even agree on what actually counts as trauma. And really, when we're talking about what counts as trauma, it's not up to us as practitioners to decide if something's traumatizing. Trauma is subjective, and it's really defined by the person experiencing that trauma. So even though there isn't much agreement on what counts as trauma, there is a predominant definition that gets used in schools, and that is that we see students as damaged because trauma has impacted their brain development. And that's true, but the way that we look at, and I shouldn't say that's true, that can be true. Trauma may impact, especially early ongoing trauma, may impact a person's brain development. But that doesn't mean that we need to focus and center that damage and see ourselves as healers. When we narrow our definition to require that children who have experienced trauma are damaged and that teachers are their saviors, doing so, and this is a quote from Elizabeth Dutro, makes it difficult to see the whole child, including the knowledge, empathy, and wisdom about life that children bring to their learning. So when we talk about trauma-affected students, we really need to start looking at how do they see the world and what are the gifts that they're bringing to the classroom, decentering the idea of damage. Within a medical model, we are pathologizing children and their families. We're saying that they're damaged and they need our help to be healed. That blinds us to the amazing gifts that they bring to the classroom. So another issue with pathologizing children who've experienced trauma is that can be intimidating for teachers who might not feel like they're capable of providing mental health care. And that's not what we're asking you to do as trauma-informed teachers. The goal is to understand, yes, that trauma impacts the brain, but also recognize that that's not a way that we want to define children. And there are ways that we can stand within the classroom and pay attention to the environmental factors and potential triggers and base our pedagogies on trauma informed practices. But the idea and the thing I'm asking you to do is shift what counts as trauma and what it means for somebody to be traumatized. So beyond Dutro's work, I've read Alvarez et al. In 2016. They problematized considering trauma as recognizable, or those factors that I mentioned before, such as abuse that gets reported, and in doing in defining trauma as recognizable, we miss this whole slew of race-based traumas that are prevalent in and out of schools. A medical model of trauma as recognizable, and this is a quote from Alvarez, invalidates other forms of trauma, the ways that factors such as race and poverty influence trauma. Ongoing racial prejudices that are allowed or even perpetuated by teachers may have the same impact as experiences of physical abuse. Alvarez, 2016, cited Romero and Roberts in 2003, saying that verbal, race-based assaults led to the same symptoms in students that one might expect to find among survivors of physical abuse, such as depression and isolation. So why does it matter whether we accept race-based trauma as legitimate? Why does it matter if we aren't recognizing the damage that seeing children as damaged has? Well, if we don't open our definition of trauma and let students define trauma on their own and let the victim define trauma, it can blind us to what some students of it can blind us to what some students of color really need from us. So I'm going to share on the screen a table from Alvarez in 2016 that should help you to expand how you view trauma in schools. So you can see that the experiences that lead to trauma that are recognizable are things we're really familiar with. We're talking about PTSD from military service, things like natural disasters, witnessing the violence that impacts other people in our communities, maybe traumatic brain injuries, poverty, are different and maybe require a paradigm shift when we start to talk about experiences leading to trauma that are unrecognizable. We're talking about racial harassment. We're talking about invalidation of a person's race. Things like underrepresentation, misrepresentation, and biases, as well as deficit lenses that I talk about all the time, that can really perpetuate trauma, perpetuate race-based inequalities in our schools that we also might just be unaware of. So in subsequent videos, I'm going to share with you how we can combat this narrow definition of what counts as trauma in schools and start to act against these deficit lenses and these medical models that might miss what really is traumatizing for some BIPOCs in our schools.